Well, thank you very much. Yeah, right there. All right, thank you very much, and thanks for coming out. And especially, I'm especially happy to be here in such a great program. As I'm actually going to stop talking and figure out what I'm doing for a minute, because that will be a lot easier if I find the right one here. And get on the right slide. All right, I'm not so good at thinking and doing that at the same time. So I'm very happy to be here in such a great program and in such, and very honored in such an August lecture series when there have been so many good people who have come here before me, and there'll be so many good people who will come after me. I hope you won't be totally disappointed in the kinds of things that I have to say. I will be talking about cities and making what kind of city work and whose city. And behind all of this will be questions of property, although they won't be theorized explicitly. You'll hear where they come out, I think. I think that's as much a lucky coincidence as anything, because I didn't prepare this around questions of property, but they are there. Instead, I'm going to be drawing on work that I'm doing with my colleagues, Kafui Attoh, who is a PhD student in my program in Syracuse, and Lynn Staeheli, who's at Durham University in England. It's a great big and totally unwieldy project called Democracy and Public Life in the United States and the United Kingdom. So that narrows it down to absolutely everything. And in that, just to make our life easier, we're looking at 4 cities, and I'm going to talk about all 4 cities tonight. They are Denver, Colorado, Oakland, California, Manchester, England, and Glasgow, Scotland. And in those 4 cities, we're looking at 4 different kinds of places, which include university campuses, where we're looking at the ways in which people engage with publics beyond the university. We're looking at questions of how people come together around the giving out of food, free food giveaways, particularly by church and other religious groups. And so we're trying to figure out what kind of publics form around the act of giving away food in public space. And then we're looking at questions of redevelopment and the way in which questions of rent and rentiers transform the mix of people who are in particular neighborhoods of cities. And we're looking at traditional public spaces, which are city streets, parks, sidewalks, those sorts of things. And in that last topic, we've become particularly interested in the question of community policing and the ways in which ideologies and practices of community policing regulate who is on the streets and who is not on the streets. And that's what I will be talking about today, because these are definitely questions of making the city work. And of course, the question of making the city work for whom. I'm going to stick very close to the script that I have here, otherwise we will be here all night. If I get going too fast, just yell and scream and let me know to slow down, because I have that habit sometimes. And then a couple of other things to let you know just before we start, so that in case you're not familiar with the geographies of all of these places, that when we're some of the names that I'll use that you might not be familiar with. I'll be talking a lot about Glasgow later on. And the policing agency for Glasgow is the Strathclyde Police. And so it's crucial that you understand that's just the citywide police. And I'm talking about one and the same when I'm talking about Glasgow and Strathclyde. The other police agencies are easy to pick up. I'll be talking about a neighborhood in Manchester called Levenshulme. I'll say a little bit more about that later. So when I say Levenshulme, it's just a neighborhood. And we'll be talking about a neighborhood in Glasgow called Govan Hill. And so just in case I'm not so clear on all of those. In 2005, the private Denver Police Foundation funded visits to Denver, Colorado, the Denver, Colorado Police Department by nationally prominent consultants to assist in the implementation of broken windows policing in the city. Broken windows policing, as you might be aware, is based on an argument developed by the criminologists James Q. Wilson and George F. Kelling, and popularized in a 1982 Atlantic Monthly magazine article. At the time, the Atlantic Monthly was a rather highbrow news and commentary magazine aimed at the liberal elite in many ways. The broken windows argument is exceedingly simple. It argues that small nuisances, such as broken windows or trash-strewn lots, unchecked panhandlers, as they called them, or problem neighbors, if left untreated, leads not only to more crime, but especially to neighborhood deterioration and the rise of social disorder. By its title, Broken Windows suggests that its primary focus is on the built environment. But as Catherine Beckett, a criminologist, and Steve Herbert, a geographer, have correctly argued, its real focus is, as they put it, on unwanted human behavior, particularly that which is engaged in by disreputable or obstreperous or unpredictable people, like panhandlers, drunks, rowdy teenagers, prostitutes, loiterers, the mentally disturbed, that's a quotation from Wilson and Kelling, as a cause of diminished quality of life for other urban residents and as a precursor to serious crime. Despite the fact that numerous studies have shown that the broken windows theory is inaccurate, it does not work on its own terms. It doesn't produce the results that it expects, namely a reduction in more serious crime. It is nonetheless taken as a near universal common sense by police agency and community activists alike, providing a significant impetus to the development of so-called zero-tolerance policing approaches to minor misconduct. Broken windows ideologies have thus become central to many models of community policing. Its general assumption that communities are under siege, that minor disorder, that is both environmental and behavior disorder, must be tackled if communities are to flourish, and that aggressive policing is central to this effort, undergird just about all officially sanctioned and adopted community policing programs in the United States and the United Kingdom, even if it is not taken to the extremes of, say, New York's zero tolerance. I've gotten ahead of myself somehow, so we'll go back. These guys I want right here. New York's zero tolerance policies of the 1990s. Broken windows is understood by many to have the particular benefit of reducing fear and thus allowing citizens to reclaim their communities. It is so understood by many people, but not by all of them. As the consultants in Denver described to us by an interviewee as these industry people who had a vested interest and made money off criminalizing and expanding the prison industrial complex in all its forms and in the surveillance of people of color. When they started arriving in Denver, some, like this African American and Latina activist that I just quoted, were quite alarmed and rather incensed. The rollout of broken windows theory in Denver featured stories in the news of Latinas in the Westwood neighborhood who felt like they couldn't walk around safely. While according to our informant there was a lot of legitimacy to these fears, she also told us that having the face of young Latinas front for the police department shift felt so manipulative. Part of our outrage was that you don't listen to us when we say we need more rec centers. You don't listen to us when we say we need more services to keep our people out of our jail. And now you're saying, oh, we're going to listen to you because we can make our community safer by bringing in more police. For her, police are a component of safety, but they are not the answer to what ails neighborhoods in Denver, especially given the antagonisms at the heart of the relationship between police and communities of color in that city. She therefore developed a campaign along with a number of other people called Fixing Broken Policing, which is a direct reference to George Kelling's book written with Catherine Coles called Fixing Broken Windows, that is frequently cited as both the Bible of and the justification for broken windows policing efforts by both news pundits and think tank workers alike. Fixing Broken Policing sought to develop a larger consciousness about this strategy they call broken windows, which is actually not the panacea, as well as to hold the police more accountability for their actions. For her, broken windows policing was not community policing. Community policing, she told us, is about getting to know who lives in the neighborhood, is about getting police out of their cars, is about walking through the neighborhood, is about knowing my son when he is coming home at night. He's coming home from college or from work. He is not a gang member. You know this because you know him, because you are familiar with the neighborhood. Community policing, for her, is also when the police are held accountable. By contrast, she argues, broken windows is simply more police targeted on hotspot areas based on data. It's to target areas, find suspicious individuals, question them until they consent to a search, and get lucky by finding something on them. Perhaps in part because of the Fixing Broken Windows policing campaign, but probably more for financial reasons and a generalized dysfunctionality of the Denver Police Department. Community policing never really fully got rooted, our activist interviewee told us. And then funding was discontinued. And foot patrols and other hallmarks of community policing, the community of policing approach, were eliminated from many neighborhoods. Much to the disappointment of other activists we spoke with, for whom broken windows policing was a central, indispensable part of their vision of community policing. As one of these other activists told us, to me, community policing is you go out and look for signs of things that could lead to more criminal behavior. Things which include not only enforcing building and zoning codes on property owners who let their buildings deteriorate, but aggressively policing homelessness. About broken windows policing, she says, everybody loves it. And everybody wants it in their neighborhood. Every resident of Denver, she says, has the right to feel safe. Broken windows policing is vital for her for promoting greater social cohesion in her working-class Denver neighborhood. So now Oakland. In Oakland, California, community policing is on much firmer financial foundation than in Denver. In 2004, voters in that city passed Measure Y with a 70% majority. Measure Y was a ballot initiative to increase taxes levied on property and on parking lots to raise $18 million annually for enhanced fire protection, anti-violence programs, and what were called policing services, with half of that latter total, half of the total money raised dedicated to this last category. In particular, Measure Y policing services funds were dedicated to hiring 63 problem-solving officers, or PSOs, to supplement the then 739 regular police officers. In 2010, voters passed another initiative, again by a 70% majority, removing a provision from Measure Y that suspended Measure Y funds for problem-solving officers if regular police staffing levels fell below 739. As budget cuts have decimated Oakland's regular police force, which they have in the last 4 years, citizens have voted to continue levying a special tax on themselves to support community policing, even though, as a Rand Corporation report detailed before the election, its evaluation of community policing, community policing part of Measure Y, was not altogether positive, due to poor training, frequent transfers of PSOs or problem-solving officers out of their beats, infringements on PSOs' time, and lack of community participation in problem-solving efforts. It is clear, in other words, that like broken windows policing, proof of effectiveness bears little relationship to community policing's popularity. The deployment of problem-solving officers is part of a reorientation of policing, often generalized simply as community policing, but which is more accurately known as problem-oriented policing, or POP. For Herman Goldstein, the originator of POP, broken windows strategies were a policing means. He thought police theorists needed to spend a lot more time thinking about what policing's ends were. For Goldstein, the essential end product of policing was dealing with a wide range of behavioral and social problems that arise in the community. These problems, he argued, are the residual problems of society, ones not yet accounted for by other institutions. Goldstein argued that police departments needed to be reoriented to continually undertake three main steps. This is going to be very profound. First, they needed to define the problem. Second, they needed to research it. And third, they needed to provide alternatives. The first step, defining the problem, was crucial. A problem like arson, Goldstein argued, was really the result of a suite of diverse behaviors, including teenagers setting fires as an act of vandalism, psychologically disturbed people setting fires out of compulsion, criminals setting fire to destroy evidence, scammers setting fire to collect insurance, crime organizations setting fires as a means of intimidation, and a lot more besides. Each type of incident poses a radically different problem for police, Goldstein argued. Similar definitional work, he also argued, it needed to be undertaken for a range of crimes and disorders like car theft, noise complaints, and so forth. The second step, research, entailed ongoing inquiry into causes, that is, what induced teens, for example, to become vandals and arsons at a particular time and particular place, into associations and correlations, what other crimes and disorders might such arson be related to, into the varieties of response, how have police typically responded, what authority do they have to respond, what works and what does not work, and so forth. The third step, exploring and providing alternatives, entailed recognizing, first of all, that police alone typically cannot solve problems. They can only ameliorate them. But this was not to say that problems could not be solved or that the police should not be at the center of their solution. Rather, it is to say that the alternatives had to be explored that went beyond traditional policing, and which Goldstein argued included promoting changes in the built environment, realigning provision of government services, improving information exchange among community members and police and the community, developing new skills, creating new forms of authority for the police, for example, allowing them to move on loiterers and homeless people rather than arresting them, developing new community resources like drop-in centers and community courts, increasing regulation, for example, mandating particular kinds of locks or soundproofing in buildings, and fine-tuning zoning. As problem solvers, police could continue to investigate crimes and make arrests, but now they especially needed to be the linchpin in understanding and addressing the residual problems, like too much noise in a neighborhood, that disturbed the social order. In Goldstein's view, police had to become a cross between urban sociologists and social workers. Goldstein's arguments garnered a great deal of attention and eventually funding from organizations like the Police Executive Research Forum in Washington, D.C., and the U.S. National Institute of Justice, leading, in fact, to a reorientation of policing in which, through POP, police would become the central agency of community development, the hub around which other services and practices would revolve. More specifically, it was to be the problem-solving officer, the PSO, that is, the neighborhood cop, who was to be the hub of the hub, as it were. The PSO's primary responsibility would be to know their locales inside and out, and to use that knowledge to shape their efforts, to define, research, and create alternatives for the specific problems that confronted them, or at least that was the goal. In Oakland, that goal seemed to be pretty widely missed. In the weeks before the 2010 election that reinforced city residents' desire to retain their PSOs, an effort that every neighborhood activist that we talked to supported, neighborhood activists complained to us about how their own PSOs often did not do very much in this area because, for example, her captain, her superior, used to take her off duty here because that was his right, as one activist told us. Another activist, who was also the chair of the citywide Measure Y Oversight Committee charged with assuring that Measure Y funds were properly spent, concurred that redeployment was a continual problem, but went a step farther. The problem-solving officers were specifically to work on problems identified by the Neighborhood Crime Prevention Council, specific to the beat they were assigned to. What better way, he asked, to deal with the problems than have somebody that's really focused on the problems that are identified by the people that live in a specific beat or have a business or are part of an institution, and take it through a process by which the problems get resolved. But in his neighborhood, he said, I didn't see that happen. The police never took one of our priorities that we established and made it a project of the problem-solving officer that they were to take through what is known as the SARA process: scan, analyze, respond, and assess, which is one of the ways in which the Goldstein approach to problem-solving has been codified within police forces. To be effective, this activist argued, PSOs needed to be not social workers, but let's call them community workers. In his own community, the Neighborhood Crime Prevention Council has been active in seeking to redress problems of crime and disorder broadly, cleaning up the strip on one of the main entrances to the neighborhood, for example, because doing so, in his view, conforms with the old broken windows theory. He went on, I think you really have to take a comprehensive approach to dealing not just with the reality of crime, but with the perception of crime. And the key to that, to me, is making as many connections as possible between different groups of people. Community policing, defined by the POP approach, is central to the promotion of community cohesion. Community policing, this activist argued, has great potential to eliminate racial profiling by getting the buy-in of the larger community. But in his own neighborhood, which is mostly working class and a mix of Latino, white, and black residents, the neighborhood council has had trouble securing and retaining the involvement of African Americans. We really failed, he said, in getting the buy-in of the larger community, of the African American community in the neighborhood. If they could get that buy-in, though, it would become apparent, he said, that we all want the same thing, and I think the cops need to see that, a safe community. Getting such buy-in has proved difficult in part because, as another activist told us, people of color are disproportionately negatively impacted by the Oakland Police Department. In fact, her organization sponsored a study that included that there are Oakland basically has two different policing systems in Oakland. One for the more affluent and typically lighter complected residents who live up in the uplands, and another system of policing for folks in what we call the flats, the lower elevations, predominantly people of color. For her, the institutionalization of PSOs through Measure Y has been a mixed bag. While neighborhood crime prevention councils have in some instances helped improve police-community relations, in other instances, she told us, they have promoted what she called a kind of vigilantism and reinforced owner versus renter tensions. This is not our view of the way community policing is supposed to work, she says. It's not supposed to essentially demonize those people who are perceived to be problematic by the more well-heeled and more vocal members in the neighborhood. Her organization was all involved in the liftoff of community policing in Oakland, she told us, in the early 1990s. We did all the reading of Herbert, that is, Herman Goldstein, and all the other guys who promoted this stuff. Our understanding is that community policing is meant to establish the community's role in how policing is conducted. But, she continues, we have a clearly polarized community here. Community policing has not been successful in establishing any kind of clear communication or receptivity from the part of this community that does not trust the police. Community cohesion in Oakland, meant to be achieved through community policing, remains, it seems, chimerical. So now, Manchester. The riots that racked English cities in the summer of 2011 caught many people off guard. As one Manchester City employee whose job focused on community safety wrote to me an email on the day after that city's hottest night, yes, it is quite ironic after my confidence around community cohesion last week. This employee was also fairly sure, however, that the riots in his city more represented a new tactic for criminals to steal rather than a major rift in society. Given the experiences of the 1980s, he said, this is a strangely reassuring conclusion, as it seems like we can deal with that. His confidence comes in part from, unlike in Oakland, the seeming success of policing in Manchester. In Manchester, PSOs are supplemented by police community support officers, as PSOs are called, the other PSOs are called there, that is PCSOs, who often end up doing the same jobs as a police officer, but who don't have the power of arrest, as one cop described them to us. They wear uniforms similar to those worn by regular police constables, only the color of their hat bands and their t-shirts vary. And they act as the eyes and the ears of the police while engaging in problem problem solving, all at a lower salary than regular police constables. Some in the Police Federation, that is the union, think that the use of PCSOs at a time of shrinking budgets is conning the public. It fools the public into thinking there are more officers about. But even those officers like the one I've just been quoted who are quite skeptical of PCSOs admit that the community likes its community support officers, the local councilors like community support officers, and albeit the results they get in terms of detecting crime are low, as a public reassurance, the results are high. In all of this, as in Denver and in Oakland, the question of who constitutes the community rises to the fore, especially as Manchester has seen an influx of new immigrants over the last 10 to 20 years, particularly Roma, Slovaks, Poles, and others from the eastern edges of the European community. South of the city center, in Levenshulme and in Gorton South, according to one police officer, there was a lot of pride in that area, and suddenly you had an influx of the Roma community. They settled here because it was cheap, affordable, private property rental available. So all of a sudden you've got this different culture arrive en masse. What happened was you ended up with a community within a community who didn't feel the need to integrate. Among other things, what seemed to upset many members of the receiving communities was that the Roma, especially men, tended to hang out on the streets in relatively large groups, sit in parks and speak a foreign language, spit sunflower seeds, and the mess that this was made was mentioned to us by a large number of interviewees, and especially also mentioned by a lot of interviewees, they didn't use the bins. At issue in this part of Manchester was how they used the street, how they used public space, we were told. For police in Manchester, it seemed, judging on how much this issue came up in our interviews, almost always unprompted. The arrival of large populations of Roma and Eastern Europeans presented the city with a classic case for pop-based community policing. The behaviors at issue were not illegal, and most cops were careful to say they were not even really antisocial. They were deeply rooted in deep differences within place, and seem to have an impact on some people's quality of life. Besides implicating questions of public space behavior, the presence of Roma and others also implicated the role of private landlords and to some degree housing associations. And they required an examination of city services like garbage collection and particularly education on both sides, geared toward, as one police-affiliated interviewee told us, changing people's habitual activity. The PSO, who's not the PCSO, the PSO for this area, an award winner who was mentioned by several other interviewees as among the very best in Manchester and actually in England, worked closely with the local member of parliament and coordinated his efforts with a local agency that had developed a mentorship program geared toward helping Roma better negotiate dominant Manchester and English culture. The officer helped to create multi-agency patrols whose members could meet a family and, as one patrol member told us, introduce them to Ross, about whom we said, this is the bin man. Ross isn't really the bin man, but he deals with the environment, and that was the best way of describing him. And Ross was then able to knock on the door and say, do you know what day you need to put your bin out? You put it out on Tuesday. Because families are highly mobile, this patrol member told us, the education can never stop. Cops are at the center of these educational efforts, coordinating them, explaining them to residents their value, constructing a framework through which a more harmonious community might be instilled. The PSO for the district thinks this is a sort of joined up or multi-agency work is crucial and seeks always to promote it. When he meets with a community, he typically brings with him a partner to speak about a project they are working on, or he asks a member of the community to speak about why they love their neighborhood. He will often seek community input because he says, I think if people can tell you what the problems are and you can address them, they'll feel better, and then the quality of life increases automatically. Because the PSO does not necessarily accept all the suggestions and demands community members place But he does not accept all the demands that community members place on him. He says, I'm not going to these meetings saying, whatever you tell me now, these are the priorities. No, people would think I've lost my pot. And if you're not familiar with English slang, that means I've gone crazy. Especially, he refuses to make all the minor complaints, from dog fouling to fading paint on the roadways, priorities for himself or for the constables under his command. Rather, he assigns them to the PCSOs and to wardens, another classification of police, even as he says that the police constables, the PCSOs, the PSOs, and the traffic wardens all work together as teams, a joint approach to it, as he puts it, on the understanding that there is an organic relationship between minor issues and larger crimes like burglaries and assault. Broken windows policing, in other words, is taken for granted in this joint approach, which he says is the heart of a kind of robust policing that improves the area. To support this robust policing and promote community buy-in, and to help assure that broken windows approaches work, Greater Manchester Police rely extensively on what are called KINs, or key informant networks. People we can pump out information to, in the words of the PSO, but also, as another interviewee put it, people we don't need to come to community meetings, but who the police and partners visit regularly, speak to, and then ask for input back from to share intelligence. These KINs can be extensive. We've got 683 streets in Groton South, says the PSO. We've got people on every single street who work with us on this stuff. So now there are about 1,200 signed up to make the place better, to give us information, exchange information, and there's nowhere else in the country with all of this buy-in. All of this buy-in and all of this effort at creating a joint approach is part of what policing theorists call the development of a total policing model, where, as theorists Harrington and Milley put it, the police serve as the control hub and coordinate a number of different strategies to tackle problems. In addition to different strategies that focus on policing as such, the police and police-related agencies more and more coordinate other programs ranging, as Herman Goldstein would be happy to hear, from planning defensible space to assisting with immigrant or asylum seeker resettlement to assuring the delivery of key services like garbage collection, all with the goal of providing not simply reassurance to community members that community order will be maintained and enhanced, but especially that the social order, that is community cohesion, as well as the maintenance of the status quo within class-riven societies, is being created and maintained. That was why our Manchester email correspondent felt a bit confident in the wake of the riots. Total policing, structured through pop policing, and broken windows interventions produce, at least it was hoped, community cohesion. In this sense, community policing defines in a city what community is. So now the last case, Glasgow. Glasgow takes the joined-up approach to policing seriously and understands community policing to be part of a much more comprehensive program of social service provision and cultural change. All kinds of actors are involved, police officers of various stripes, of course, but also housing association managers, city council workers, city council members, the fire department, code enforcement officers, private landlords, environmental health workers, the education department, and more. And in Govan Hill, they meet daily at, appropriately enough, a place called the Huib. Only one key player seems perpetually absent from the Huib: community members themselves. The local beat police officer takes the lead at the Huib in a partnership meeting that is basically a problem-solving group, as a police inspector told us. We take a look at what's happened in the last 24 hours in that area, he continued, and if there's things that we think are relevant for our partners to be involved in, we'll do information sharing and try to do problem-solving around that. Before there was the Huib, according to a different police officer, We had difficulty knowing who to contact with a particular difficulty, but with the Huib, we can pass all our difficulties on to the police coordinator who can take it straight to the correct department, as opposed to us trying to track it down through a million different numbers to try to find the right person to speak to. And it allows other associations or other partners to bring information to the police that maybe wouldn't always be brought to the police's attention. In doing so, police in Govan Hill assume the central role in determining and producing community cohesion. According to the inspector quoted just a second ago, no residents go to that meeting because it is a partnership meeting. Resident input is instead garnered through monthly community councils where we, that is the Strathclyde Police, go along and do an input in relation to what the crime statistics look like. Another officer described these monthly meetings as greetin' meetings, and I don't have a good Glasgow accent, so it doesn't even sound right, but greetin' is an old Scottish word for crying. So crying means, which in many ways makes clear just how the police understand the role of community members in their operations. The community members can come to them and cry if they want. After the partnership meeting at the Huib, the group might in fact visit a local resident or somebody who's got antisocial behaviors and do a partnership visit to them and speak to them about the antisocial aspects of what's been happening, and perhaps develop a further intervention such as an acceptable behavior contract as part of their tenancy agreement with their housing association. Whatever its other effects, these partnership visits are meant to provide reassurance to other community members. The biggest thing in community policing, we are told over and over again in Glasgow, is public reassurance, reassuring the public about what we are doing. According to a police officer, beginning in October 2010, Strathclyde Police made a concerted effort to have community officers on the streets, and they are very visible, providing public reassurance. And basically, we have feedback directly from members of the community saying, I feel safe to be out and about because I know the police are round about the area. Who is being reassured, however, that is, which members of the community, is not clear, nor is it very clear what they are being reassured about. Indeed, not all Glasgow residents are so easily reassured. Those who exist beyond the bounds of police-defined civic community are often hostile to police presence, as one police officer told us. As one young activist argued, it is important to remember that while the state exists as it does under capitalism and you've got inequality, the role of the police is to maintain social peace in society where there is inequality and injustice. And he goes on to say, crime is indeed a real problem in Glasgow, but policing is class-based and class-biased. I don't think there is any denying the fact that you need to police, but people are frustrated because look at how many resources and hours have been poured into harassing and attacking us activists in Govan Hill, and everyone knows the heroin and drug dealing and the rest that is going on, and it seems to be untouched. Some landlords rent flats for £800 a month without electricity or toilets. That's the real problem in community, yet they're after us. As a comrade of his argued, the police are an arm of the state and they represent the government and a system that's protecting the interests of a minority at the expense of people in Govan Hill and all over. Community policing and community cohesion, in this view, is a class project aimed at protecting the current order. And the groups that meet at the Huib are, as one activist told us, supposedly independent, that supposedly represent the interests of the local people in Govan Hill. They are really there to maintain social control. They are collaborating with the Strathclyde Police. The organizations are supposed to represent the local people, instead participate in controlling the area and making sure nothing gets out of hand, that there is no real change. Central to these efforts in Glasgow is Glasgow Community and Safety Services, or GCSS, which is an arm's-length external organization set up by the local government and Strathclyde Police established in 2006. GCSS is wholly owned by the council and the police and has the mandate of making people feel safe and secure in their communities by responding to antisocial behavior, crime, and disorder. The GCSS roots its work in broken windows theory, which, according to a Strathclyde officer, the Strathclyde police have always worked to from the 80s right through. As with other policing agencies in Britain, GCSS relies heavily on the use of antisocial behavior orders, though it always asks before issuing one, is there anything we can do to assist you to stop doing that behavior? GCSS relies on the use of community enforcement officers, as they're called in Scotland, which are known as the other uniformed officers, to issue fixed penalty notices for dog fouling, littering, that type of thing, to provide reassurance and to gather community intelligence, just as in Manchester. It operates an extensive network of fixed and mobile CCTV. It coordinates crime prevention through environmental design technologies and efforts, and it deploys hotspot intervention teams, which are youth diversionary staff with mobile football pitches that can be quickly set up in consultation with community organizations as a form of preventative work. Well, so what? Why have I just spent all of this time giving you all of these details about policing in 4 cities? Why did I start sneaking in language of community cohesion? And what does this have to do with the question of making cities work and making them work for whom? It is because the practices of and struggles over community policing in each of the cities open windows onto different facets of what my co-authors and I, my co-investigators and I, think is a significant evolution in urban development in the neoliberal era. The production of what could be called policing-centered community cohesion. Community cohesion has become something of a mantra, a buzzword in Britain in the last decade, especially in the wake of the 2001 riots in Oldham, Bradford, and Burnley. It is a phrase less heard in the United States, though the practices it indicates and the problems the discourse of cohesion seeks to address are important there also. Community cohesion generally refers to cohesion both within specific communities, or what used to be called subcultures, and among such communities within a neighborhood, city, or region. The policy discourse that grew up around the concept of community cohesion, as Michael Ratcliffe notes, overly ethnicizes it and tends to use discourses of community cohesion to smooth over economic inequalities and exclusions. Class does enter into the discussion, but usually only in relation to ethnicity. In much of the official discourse in Britain on community cohesion, for example, Muslim communities were presented as too cohesive and thus not well integrated into larger English society, and white working class communities were presented as not cohesive enough, that is, disarticulated from their own communities. Our interviews with police and urban managers, like that Manchester correspondent, suggested, however, that they tend to use the idea of community cohesion quite loosely, as an indicator of a well-functioning or even secure community in which residents seem to be relatively content, and crime, antisocial behavior, and the like are extraordinary rather than formative of social life. Such a broad sense of community cohesion accords well with the definition of community cohesion offered by the Home Office in Britain in a report it issued in the wake of the 2001 riots, which is called the Cancel Report. The report argued that community cohesion consisted of several identifiable domains, the first of which was common values and civic culture, which they defined as common aims and objectives, common moral principles and codes of behavior, support for political institutions, and participation in politics. The second domain was social order and social control, which they defined as absence of general conflict and threats to the existing order, absence of incivility, effective informal social control, and importantly, tolerance, respect for differences, and intergroup cooperation. The third domain was social solidarity and reductions in wealth disparities, which they defined as harmonious economic and social development and common standards, redistribution of public finances and opportunities, equal access to social service and welfare benefits, and ready acknowledgments of social obligations and willingness to assist others. It's telling that it's only public finances that are talked about in terms of redistributional politics here. The fourth domain is social networks and social capital, which they define as a high degree of social interaction within communities and families, civic engagement, and associational activities. It's hard to look at both of these when you have bifocals. And easy resolution of collective action problems. The fifth domain and the last domain was place attachment and identity, which included a strong attachment to place and the intertwining of personal and place identity. So if one of the primary roots of community policing historically, particularly in the United States, was the demand, particularly by minority communities, for greater authority over the police, and this was made clear in a number of our interviews in California, and it's clear in the history as well, the operationalization of the ideology of community cohesion, incomplete as our case studies show it is, reverses that logic and puts the authority of the police right at the center of community. So let me explain that point. Note how in both the literatures on community cohesion and in fact in community policing, community is rarely defined. In the latter, especially the literature that seeks to promote and analyze the effectiveness of various community policing strategies, including pop policing, the complexity of the term community is frequently admitted. For example, Harrington and Milley remark in a footnote in an article assessing the effectiveness of reassurance policing that there are many problems in defining community, but that complexity is then typically held in abeyance and a spatial placeholder is introduced, something like neighborhood, locality, or bounded area. Neither the question of who constitutes the community nor what power relations may shape that community tends to be asked in the policing literature. The effect in both the policing literature and more widely in society, as Steve Herbert has argued, is that community functions as what he calls a God word, before which we genuflect in lieu of examining it critically. The further effect is that by spatializing community into neighborhood or locality, while refusing to question just who constitutes the community that occupies the neighborhood, makes broken windows the panacea. It becomes common sense to cleanse the neighborhood of unwanted people and things, wherein what constituted unwanted is defined largely by the police themselves or those powerful members of the society who have their ear. Even more, it allows the police or policing agencies more broadly to fill the empty signifier of community. In this sense, the emptiness of community is not so much a problem as an opportunity. After all, as Lynn Staeheli has extensively shown, community is contested, struggled over, both as a concept and as a reality of lived life. And in that struggle, it is defined, given shape. Its relations of power are settled, if not permanently, then at least for a time and fairly solidly. As powerful as the concept of community is ideologically, in other words, it is a lot like a lot of other key words of social life, such as culture. There is no a priori such thing as community or of culture. Both are formed in process, the reified result of social struggle. What community is, and therefore what community cohesion is a function of the struggles that go into its making. Community cohesion is, in this view, a function of struggle over and in community, and especially the ability to win the struggle to define community itself. The lack of definition of community and community cohesion and community policing literature and practice can be understood, therefore, as to some degree strategic. By holding definitions of community in abeyance, the meaning and actuality of community can be and is produced in the actual practices of policing. The fixing of broken windows, the arrest of homeless people, the dispersal of sunflower seeds spitting Roma, the creation of hubs that admit no community members to the deliberation, or, as the last example, the development of problem-solving officers. Increasingly, in other words, community and community cohesion are produced by putting practices of policing at the heart of efforts to transform the social conditions that shape social life and social interaction on the ground. As Nicholas Rose has argued, community is not simply the territory within which crime is to be controlled. It is itself a means of government. Its ties, bonds, forces, and affiliations are to be celebrated, encouraged, nurtured, shaped, and instrumentalized in the hopes of enhancing the security of each and all. As is well known, government, or these days governmentality, produces subjects and doesn't just govern society. It gives society shape, structure, and form in the first place. Likewise, policing. Community policing, with broken windows-based reassurance at its heart, has become the means by which community is given form, given definition, and made to cohere, both through the transformation of urban landscapes and through the transformation of people's collective and individual bases for social life. It does this by defining common values and deciding who and what behaviors transgress them. It does this through creating new hubs with the police at the center, around which civic culture is made to revolve. Through policing, people become attached to place or are expelled from it, as in Oakland and Manchester. And it's through policing that they shape their identities, even if in opposition to dominant modes of policing, as in Denver and Glasgow, while social networks are strengthened and interrupted through policing. Even more, in many instances, the very problems of social solidarity and inequality are attacked only in relation to policing. As, for example, access to subsidized housing is tied to behavioral contracts. This practice came out strongly in our interviews in Manchester and Glasgow, and is now standard practice in the United States through what are called housing first interventions, which is the new ideology of homelessness, which both Denver and Oakland have signed on to, which provides housing before it deals with social problems for homeless people. But it only does so on the condition that people behave themselves in the first place. Policing-centered community cohesion is thus promoted by placing policing at the center of each of the domains that define social cohesion, installing force, the force of law, as well as the legitimate use of violence, behind those modes of informal social control that policing finds acceptable, behind efforts to educate toward a certain mode of tolerance, inclusion, and indeed assimilation, as in Manchester, and by installing the police themselves at the center of the hub of activities through which questions of social inequality and social service provision are to be addressed. It does all of this, of course, only by excluding from this tight-knit world those people and behaviors that the authorities or powerful members of the community determine to be outside of acceptable norms or to threaten established social order. In the process of creating community cohesion, it defines community itself and establishes its limits. It does so by organizing activity under a total policing model, which is, in fact, hardly surprising, since, as the shorter Oxford English Dictionary reminds us, the first definition of policing is the regulation and control of community. But, like I just said a second ago, so what? This is by way of conclusion. In an important recent paper, Peter Marcuse argued that the key questions to be answered in relation to the slogan, "The right to the city," is what rights, whose rights, and what city? He argues that it is the future city, the city to be made to work, that we need to be fighting for, that the we in the first place has to be the directly oppressed and the alienated, and the rights to be fought for are the rights to be central in the making of the city as an oeuvre, that is, a work, the right to make the future city. Such a right is predicated on rights to housing, to livelihood, to freedom from oppression, and to safety. Such a right is predicated on a world in which broken windows is not the panacea. And yet, as Trevor Paglen, the geographer and artist, so perfectly puts it, geography sculpts the future. The spaces we create place possibilities and constraints on that which is yet to come, because the world of the future must quite literally be built out of the spaces of the past. To change the future, then, means changing the material spaces of the present. What city? the future city, Peter Marcuse argues. But any future city must be built out of the city that is here and now. And it is a city whose spaces are more and more defined by the total policing model in which broken windows is the panacea. Whose city? More and more the city of the here and now is the police's city. This is far more advanced. The project of policing-centered community cohesion is more complete and less contested in Britain, particularly in England, than it is in the United States, where the implementation of community policing, as the first two examples showed, is far less total. But in both countries, the struggle for the future city is clearly being won by government in the sense that Nicholas Rose used the term. And it is won by squeezing out, if not actively eliminating, the directly oppressed and the alienated, as the police produce a particular and particularly regulated community, and a form of cohesion designed to protect the status quo, a cohesion in absence of general conflict and threats to the existing order, as the Cantel report put it, as well as support for political institutions and participation in politics, even if these might sometimes be coupled with social solidarity and reductions in wealth disparity. Problem-oriented policing, like community policing in general, is in many ways quite attractive. Like the Glasgow activists say, there will always be a need for police. But with the rise of policing-centered community, what the rise of policing-centered community cohesion suggests is that the struggle for any broader right to the city, a city more akin to what Lefebvre dreamed was possible, will entail taking the total policing model that is community policing as it has evolved over, taking on the total policing model that is community policing as it has evolved over the past generation. It will require that the police become subservient to the struggles that define urban community, that they are placed in a subordinate position of authority rather than definitive of urban community. Broken windows is definitely not the panacea, but attacking broken windows ideologies and practices, and their variated kin, like pop policing, practices that make community a function of policing rather than vice versa, which is what our Denver activist was struggling for, must be the starting point if the cry and the demand of the directly oppressed and the alienated for the right to the city are to be heard. So, thank you.